Earlier in the week, we got some unfortunate news that a certain Ohio native committed to play football at Michigan. Losing to Michigan Thanksgiving weekend, it stings. But it also stings losing to them in the offseason. How does this commitment from Jordan Marshall to the Wolverines impact Ohio State? We discuss that today on Locked on Buckeyes.
You are Locked on Buckeyes, your daily podcast on the Ohio State Buckeyes. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Buckeye fans? Welcome back to another episode of Locked on Buckeyes, part of Locked on Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jay Stevens, also the host of the Jay Stevens Podcast. It is Friday, March 24th in the year 2023, and this episode is brought to you by our good friends at FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/Locked On today to get started. During this episode, we will be joined by John Garcia Jr. He is Locked On's football recruiting insider. John and I go through the commitment from Jordan Marshall, where he did not go to the in-state school, Ohio State, but he did commit to play for Michigan. Discuss how that impacts Ohio State recruiting. And Elijah Moore, a four-star wide receiver from the state of Maryland, recently put the Buckeyes in his top 10. We'll discuss what that means for Ohio State and what he is as a football player. It's a feel-good Friday, and let's enjoy our time together with another football recruiting update with our guy, John Garcia Jr. And joining us now here on Locked on Buckeyes, it's one of our favorite guests we have here on the show. It is John Garcia Jr. He is Locked On's football recruiting insider. John, it's a great time to have you on because Buckeyes got some news earlier in the week that they did not like. John, it's been a long time since we've been on. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Not as well as the rival fan base, maybe, based on the next kid we'll talk about. But look, that's the beauty of covering elite recruits. You know, these battles are really close, and sometimes when they break one way, there's doors opening for another group of recruits. So yeah, excited to talk about it.
There are a couple guys on the list for today, and one of them, unfortunately, is a kid that committed to the rival school, the Michigan Wolverines, earlier in the week. It is Jordan Marshall out of Cincinnati Moeller High School. I say Cincinnati. I'm from Indiana, so every time we say a school in Cincy, you put the city in front of it. But young man, talented, 5'10", 193. Going to Michigan is tough, but when he says his dad's an Ohio State fan, but his dad's going to start rooting for Michigan now, it kind of hits a little bit different. John, were you shocked? Let's just start here. Were you shocked when he picked Michigan over Ohio State?
Yeah, on the surface level, in the recruiting industry, you kind of know, hey, Michigan has done it through development, especially relative to Ohio State. High-level prospects have, by and large, chosen OSU over more times than not. But especially when it's a kid from Ohio that Ohio State really wants at the running back position,
Correct.
You just don't expect that kid to leave the state, especially before official visit season. So surprising optically, but also timeliness wise, because he already had set multiple official visits, including one to Ohio State in June, by the way. So curious to see that decision making get so accelerated, even with trips theoretically still on the docket. So we'll see in a couple months if he is going to do some due diligence and take those trips, but certainly optically and like I said, from a timeline perspective, very much surprised that he popped from Michigan. But look, he was on campus last weekend and obviously fell in love with what's going on there. And you know, to their credit, to Michigan's credit, that position has been a star position recently on that roster. These playoff runs that Michigan's put together have been very ground laden, and they've got multiple guys who have that cachet next to their name. So understandably a good time for Michigan to maybe uptick the recruiting of the running back position.
Absolutely. To me, it was shocking because Ohio State recently talked about trying to put more of an emphasis on the state of Ohio and the Midwest and recruiting those guys. And so that's one thing that stuck out of my mind. It's Ohio State, and they had to kind of revamp how they're recruiting based off NIL and how that has impacted the recruiting trail for everybody, not just like the top 10, top 5 guys. A lot of those guys that are out there that are bigger name guys, it's impacting the recruitment. And Ohio State fine-tuned things and found a formula, or they hopefully have a formula that's going to work and lead to success, Big Ten championships, wins over Michigan, national championships. And in all of that, there's a guy that's not far. You're thinking, great, we got him. You don't. I remember, John, we talked about this, I want to say during the season, and there were people wondering if there's a problem with Ohio State recruiting. I personally don't think so. I think you're going to win some, you're going to lose some. But that conversation, John, is being had once again all over the socials. People wondering, if we can't get guys inside of our own state, if we can't get big-name guys, what's going on with the recruiting? How do you kind of view that topic about if Ohio State's recruiting has issues right now?
I think these are more exceptions to the rule, but you can look anywhere and find cases like this that are optically, I guess, frustrating. I don't know if that's the right word for it. Optically surprising. Let's say that. I mean, you look at this past cycle, Georgia goes back-to-back on the field as national champs, yet Alabama has the number one recruiting class, including the top 2 recruits in the state of Georgia, right? So, again, optically, you're like, what do you mean? Georgia is maybe the next dynasty in the sport, yet 2 Atlanta area kids, one of them a Georgia legacy, signed with Alabama, right? So, I mean, it happens every single year. Right now, in the state of Alabama, conversely, Georgia's got the number one player verbally committed. So it really does kind of go both ways across the country. There's really no state, even Louisiana, with LSU being the only Power 5 school in the state, there's really no state where everything is locked down 100% of the time. There's just too many variables in today's recruiting. You mentioned NIL being one of them. Obviously, that's a huge deal. And I think, there's a contrarian aspect to this thing as well. I know, being a South Florida native, a lot of kids grow up down here wanting to leave. They could love the Hurricanes and Miami and Mario Cristobal and all those things, but they just want to experience something else. Not to say that that's a cause or effect everywhere in recruiting, but that does exist, especially in metropolitan areas. So there's so many variables, Jay, as to why these kids make verbal commitments. And let's also say, hey, it's March. There's a lot that can and will change, but to go forward, I think, look, Ohio State's going to have a great running back haul in this class. Tony Alford is a beast at his gig. Everybody understands that. And the amount of high-level backs that are high on the Bucks is still large in volume, even in the state of Ohio. I mean, Sam Williams-Dixon is a guy who told me recently, hey, I'm getting close to making this verbal commitment. So you wonder now, does Ohio State look even more appealing with one of the other top Ohio running backs leaving the state as far as a verbal commitment is concerned? So this will correct itself. There's 3, 4, 5 other backs that OSU is very high in on. But yeah, understandably frustrating from the Ohio State perspective when an in-state kid who maybe was viewed as a lock at one point elects to not only go out of state, but to go play for your rival.
John, let's stick right there. You mentioned Sam Williams-Dixon. Who are some other guys that Ohio State has on their radar, running back-wise, that might say, hey, I'm committing to the Buckeyes either in the near future or down the road?
Well, look, James Peoples is a high-level back from Texas, 2,000-yard back. We know the Buckeyes, J.K. Dobbins comes to mind. They can go down to Texas and grab a great running back. It happens more times than people may realize. So Peoples is very high there on OSU. We mentioned Williams-Dixon. He was on campus recently. He's only got one other visit ahead, maybe before a commitment. Miami's looking to get involved here, but really Ohio State, Kentucky have done the best job with Williams-Dixon. Penn State in there to some degree, but I think the in-state Buckeyes, again, especially right now, have to be the favorite going into that decision-making process. Stacey Gage is worth bringing up. Big physical, downhill back, grew up idolizing Ezekiel Elliott. And from the beginning, first talked to him when he was a sophomore, he was like, hey, I will go to Ohio State before all is said and done. So there's other contenders, Oklahoma, Florida, Miami among them, but Ohio State will get an official visit out of him. And then they're still in the running for a couple guys that are maybe trending or committed elsewhere, right? You might lose a kid, but you might be a flip candidate elsewhere. And Chauncey Bowens is worth bringing up here. This is a kid out of South Florida, North Palm Beach, the Benjamin School, committed to the Florida Gators since last fall, but recently has added Ohio State, Georgia, and Alabama offers. So he is open to at least taking visits to those schools. So the next step naturally for OSU get him on campus, and see where the chips may fall thereafter. So I think it's going to be a multi-running back class for Ohio State. There's still talent in state, but obviously well beyond. The Buckeyes are still very much highly considered by a lot of the big-time backs.
John, you watch football. You're a football fan, college football fan, and you have seen Ohio State running backs, not just on the recruiting, but you have seen kind of Trevion Henderson in his freshman year, but then it dipped off in his sophomore year, had injuries, battles that he had. We saw Mayan Williams play well, but not to the elite level that we saw from a J.K. Dobbins or even Ezekiel Elliott. Those are two special backs, don't get me wrong, but there seems to be something maybe missing when you think about a running back at Ohio State. Some may say there's that elite guy, but they don't know if that elite guy is a healthy Henderson, if it's going to be Mayan Williams, if it's Evan Pryor down to Hayden once they get their time and the number is called. Do you think what we've seen over the past couple of years has kind of impacted how the youngsters in high school view Ohio State running backs?
Not at all. Understand where you're going with this, Jay. It looks like it's like they haven't been able to get on track. A rhythm has not yet been established there with OSU, but great backs, obviously. I mean, Trevion Henderson, one of the best high school running backs I've ever scouted. I mean, just unbelievable stuff, even losing a year due to COVID-19 there at the prep level. So you wish good health for all those guys to be able to eventually figure it out. But yeah, I don't think talent is the issue. Obviously, depth, not an issue there either. Dallin Hayden really stepped up among those younger backs. But that's not something intricately that these prep running backs are going to look at. That's not something that they're going to recognize. If anything, it's the opposite. The allure, the shadow of Zeke and JK, and the presence and stability of Tony Alford in particular is viewed conversely as a plus. And this is viewed as a stable, whether it's a committee or a bell cow situation, this is viewed as a program that will figure it out at the running back spot. So it's still one of those offers, Jay, that when it comes into a running back, it means a lot. And think of the backs that we talked about. Of course, you've got your Ohioans, but Peoples is out of San Antonio. Gage is out of Broward County, Florida. These kids are all over the country still viewing that Ohio State offer in incredibly high regard across the board, but running back is certainly not one of those positions where it's taken maybe a step down. I think QB, running back, receiver, DB, I mean, those in particular, pass rusher, let's throw in there, those hit different when Ohio State comes in for recruits. I do still think that's the case in this class of 24. Just again, the timing is tough coming off of the on-field product and, of course, this most recent, commitment decision.
John, last thing here about the running backs and the recruiting. I'm going to open it up by saying and discussing kind of how full this running back room is. Because I'm thinking about it just in my head now. You got Chip Train, a transfer from Arizona State. I'm not sure about his eligibility, but my guess is it's going to be up here really, really soon. Trevion Henderson, Mayan Williams, they're probably going to be in school next year. You got Evan Pryor, Dallin Hayden, who are going to be in school. You got some walk-on running backs that are really good. Like, this is a running back room where you probably got 5-6 deep that are guys that can play this year. A couple could be starters, a few could be backups, and some guys that are in the back of the room just aren't. Just room's too full, too talented to get them on there. And I say all that to kind of go back to the recruiting. How many running backs do you think Ohio State takes in commitments this year in this recruiting class?
I think anytime there's a threat where you lose your number one and number two backs in the same year, like this year presents, I think you got to take two. And I think the volume, the number of targets we're seeing from Tony Alford himself, I think that number has expanded. We've seen a very consistent effort from Alford recently, guys who are getting offers in December and January even. So I do think that it's going to be a larger number rather than shorter. You obviously got to get your first before you can grab your second. I should have mentioned Boo Carter earlier. Okay. He's a kid out of Tennessee that some view as a DB. Ohio State is recruiting as a running back, and he just set an official visit for the month of June to Ohio State. So if you want to play offense, coming from the same state as Dallin Hayden, running back at Ohio State is a decent way to go. So there's a hefty group of guys that feel like priority targets when you go Peoples, Williams, Dixon, Gage, Boo Carter. I mean, there's 4, 5, 6 guys that are going to be official visit candidates for the Buckeyes, and usually the number's not as high if you're only going to take one back. So my gut is you probably aim for 2 backs. Now, anything can change that, right? The portal window is going to open up again in May. Spring ball could change some things schematically or personnel-wise, but I think the target is probably 1 to 2 backs, with 2 being the most likely scenario, at least as I can see it from an outside perspective looking in the month of March.
Guys, today's show is not going to be full of a guy who committed to Michigan. I would not be a good host of this podcast if we went that route. There's another young man out of the state of Maryland, Elijah Moore, who recently announced his top 10, whittled down his list, kind of fine-tuned that thing, and the Buckeyes are in the mix. And as we do with John all the time, I'll look at this list, and I'll get to it in a second. But there's a lot of South Florida, a lot of Florida schools, a couple Florida schools that are here in this as well. Of course, the in-state school, Maryland, is in his top 10. But the Buckeyes are there. It's a 6'4" wide receiver, 190 pounds, class of 2024. And this young man, with the height that he has, with his ability to get open, to high point the ball, it just seemed like when I'm watching him play in his highlights, I'm like, okay, you can't get that, but he can. There were some times when he was out there blocking, laying the wood, bringing the lumber. Okay, you have a little, you can block as well, and I like receivers that can block. Ohio State loves them as well. This young man, John, is at 6'4", as young as he is, he seems a lot more polished than I think a receiver would be at his height right now in his career.
100%. You know, I think he's still apexing, right? This is a kid who I believe got the Ohio State offer when he was on campus for the Michigan game. So a relatively recent target compared to these other guys. So that means he's still on the ascent. That means that he's still on the up and up, and schools are circling back on him. But yeah, the profile is very easy to sell, right? 6'4", 190, as you mentioned, big-bodied kid, can back shoulder it, can high point it, and decent after the catch as well. He's not just a big body, let me out rebound you as a wide receiver type of prospect. There's some polish here. The routes are crisp. There's some nice double moves to his resume there as well. And again, we talked about it earlier. When you're a receiver and you got that OSU offer, you're going to consider it pretty highly, even though the number 1 receiver in the country is committed right now in Jeremiah Smith, and you're in great position for other wide receivers to potentially join him. But I think what's interesting with Elijah, in addition to him being a receiver named Elijah Moore, like the NFL player, is Ohio State didn't really bring in that type of player last cycle. You know, and typically when you recruit, you view it in a 2-year window. You want to bring in counters and variants within these 2-class halls. So best receiver haul in the country last year, Ennis, Tate, Rogers. You guys know the name right now, both Rogers and Rogers with a D. But nobody with that sheer size and 50-50 ball back shoulder ability of an Elijah Moore. Now, I think some of the guys last year are more polished, more explosive, just different styles than Elijah, but you need that variance, that balance in your game. So I do think it's interesting that they didn't really sign a guy like that. Everybody was polished and physical and great at the point of attack, but not that guy that you're just like, hey, I'm going to throw it up to you, and more times than not, you're going to come down with it. So I do think that's an interesting angle for Ryan Day and Brian Hartline to sell the next time that Elijah gets on campus. Again, he did take that visit in November. So now the next step is, hey, get him on campus again. And I think the plans there are in the works for him to get back to Columbus. So with a receiver recruit, especially one that appears intriguing and ascending, Ohio State's going to make a great claim if they green light him for a verbal commitment. So that will be one to track for sure. And you expect another great haul, especially when your first guy happens to be Jeremiah Smith. That's a heck of a start.
It's a wonderful start. We mentioned, and I talk about him being able to high point the ball and the back shoulder stuff. I am sitting here thinking, okay, cool, like the DB is going to get a hand doing it, but you're going to have to battle, and you're going to win. You're going to win the battle with the DB when some of these shows that the quarterback is throwing to this young man. The consistency, and John, talk about this all the time with Stroud and his pro day and his combine performances. People are like, what wowed you about Stroud and his combine or pro day? Is that he does it over and over and over and over, and it's consistent. Like, he's doing elite stuff the same way, same rep. It looks the same every single time. That's what wows me about Stroud, is that he just does it consistently. Like, I used to get tired of sometimes you can get, like, lulled down and kind of take for granted the consistency in a player. Stroud's kind of wowing me right now, and I don't want to take for granted how consistent he is as a thrower. with Elijah Moore, I don't want to take for granted he was a junior in high school, and he's doing a lot of things that freshmen and sophomore in college struggle with. Now, granted, the competition is better, but they struggle with the back shoulder stuff, the high pointing of the ball. It don't matter if you're 6'4" or 5'10", you struggle with that. He's doing it very, very well, and there's a consistency there. And I know Brian Hartline is going to love to have him here because you mentioned it. He's a different type of receiver, and that 6'4" height, probably going to add about 10 pounds at least before getting on the field consistently in college. You add that, you add some muscle with the height there. That's a weapon that Ohio State, whoever the quarterback is going to love to have at his disposal in a few years at Ohio State if that's where he commits to play football.
Yeah, and they're in a great spot, obviously, right? You know, the trajectory and the track record of receiver recruiting is always in the green. It's always on the up and up, stock up emoji, whatever you want to call it, at Ohio State. So you know it's going to be a great haul every year.
Yeah.
You just don't necessarily know the name. But yeah, I do think Elijah presents something a little bit different compared to Jeremiah Smith, but also compared to the entire receiver haul, the four-man haul from the 2023 cycle. And that's a good thing for him. I think that increases his chances to end up at a school like Ohio State because you always want to present the most challenging thing you can to a defense. And if you've got 3 or 4 receivers that are all different physically, height and weight and speed wise and skill set wise, I think it puts more pressure on those defensive backs that are already at a disadvantage. Let's be honest, especially when the Buckeyes are out there. So I do think that's really interesting, the most interesting aspect of Elijah. But yeah, the consistency is there. The ball control, their body control, I should say, and the ball tracking. I think that is an element of wide receiver play that we all sort of take for granted, right?
Yeah.
Everybody's throwing it more, but the way that you can track a football in the air says a whole lot about you as a wide receiver. I mean, go back to the Super Bowl, that Jalen Hurts to A.J. Brown touchdown. Hurts just slung it out there. It was A.J. Brown's tracking ability and extension that put that 50 whatever yard play as a viral highlight in the Super Bowl. So, but AJ played baseball in high school, so tracking was one of his biggest strengths. Even though everybody has always been wowed by 6'2", 6'3", big, physical, strong, how he tracked the football was the reason why he scored a Super Bowl touchdown. So that is an underrated element of wide receiver play, especially in this day and age where everybody's throwing it downfield more than really we've ever seen.
The top 10, haven't gone over that just yet. I kind of hinted that there were some not really South Florida, a South Florida school, but a couple Florida schools that are in this list. The Buckeyes, of course, in this top 10, Oregon, Penn State, Florida, Wisconsin, Texas A&M, Michigan, Florida State, Miami, Maryland. If you're just trying to put a group of 5, I'm not going to ask you to rank them, but if you're trying to put just a group of 5, what schools are in kind of like that cluster right there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, he's a Maryland kid, right? Catholic school league guy. I think the Terrapins are going to stay involved there. It's the school he's been to the most. You understand the familiarity there. And Mike Locksley offensively, I mean, they've put some things together, right?
Yeah.
You know, optically, it's a stronger area of that roster expectation-wise. So I think they stay in it. I think Ohio State and Penn State stay in it again. Big Ten, familiarity, all of those things. And then it's kind of open for me. If I had to crystal ball 2 other teams, I mean, kids love Oregon, you know, so if he gets out there for a visit, I wouldn't be surprised. And then you can't ignore SEC country, right? You mentioned A&M, you mentioned Florida, some big-time programs in SEC country. I do think visit-wise, if he gets down there and starts to fall in love a little bit, I could see the SEC kind of sneaking in back door to this race for Elijah Moore. Even though he's a Maryland Big Ten East Coast guy, I could see some down south schools presenting as a true threat.
Has he scheduled any official visits?
Not that I've seen. I could be wrong here. I don't think he's gotten to that point. I think he's still on the spring unofficial visit train as far as I can tell. But again, he's been to Ohio State once. I expect him to be back before all is said and done. If you had to guess from the OSU perspective, that June 15th, 16th window, which is when Boo Carter, who we mentioned earlier, is going to visit, that looks like it's becoming the big visit weekend of the summer. Ohio State's already got 5, 6, 7 guys confirmed for that official visit weekend. So if you had to guess, that could be a target area where Ohio State's clearly going to look to accelerate their pace in the class of 24.
John, it's always fun having you on. Can't wait till the next time. I have a list of probably 5 or 6 guys that I got literally just today from just searching guys that you and I might talk about. I'm sure the next time between now and then we schedule stuff, there may be more guys that come up as far as targets for Ohio State or guys who might commit to be Buckeyes in the future. John, if you could let everyone know where they can follow you on Twitter in case they want to get more insight into just general recruiting or Ohio State recruiting away from the show, where can they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. John Garcia _JR there on Twitter. And of course, across the Locked On Network, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all those deals. We're talking about just about every single day. So come check it out.
And guys, you can follow me on Twitter at jstevens07. Send all of your emails to jstevens317@gmail.com. We're out of here today with John Garcia Jr. Love having him on. Got a lot of great insight on Jordan Marshall, and Elijah Moore as well. There'll be more great recruits that we'll be talking about and how likely it is if they commit to Ohio State in the future. John, as always, I thank you for having you on. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jay. Take care.